One of the risks of speaking last is that everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. But what I wanted to do was to join the other speakers in congratulating the men and women of the Office of Naval Research for the huge impact that you've had not only for the Navy, but for the nation. And I was not aware of ONR support for Danny Kahneman, so I wanted to tell you a little story about the impact that Danny has had on the nation and in a really personal way. 3 years ago, I got an email from a young woman who expressed some interest in working at the White House. So she sent me her resume, and turns out that she was a child violin prodigy with Itzhak Perlman, had won the major undergraduate awards at Yale, was a Rhodes Scholar, and then did a postdoc at Stanford in decision neuroscience. So being the really adventurous guy that I was, I decided to take a chance on her. And I said, "What do you want to do?" And she said, "Well, we're learning all this, these new things about how people actually make decisions. Economists had always assumed that the way people made decisions is that they have perfect information and they're 100% rational, utility maximizing agents. And we've learned a lot from people like Danny Kahneman about how people actually make decisions. And what I want to do is to take those insights and have them inform government policy and the delivery of government programs. And in short order, she got the president to sign an executive order creating something called the Social and Behavioral Sciences Team. She recruited 20 behavioral scientists and now has a waiting list of 500 people that want to join her team. And she has 60 partnerships across the federal government, including the Defense Department. So one of the really things that we've learned about how to convince more people to save is that you can have a dramatic impact on the savings rate if you change the default on an IRA from opt-in to change it from opt-in to opt-out. So that is, you're automatically enrolled unless you call up HR and say, I don't want to participate in the IRA. So she's been working with the Defense Department to get more of the men and women of the armed services to take advantage of federal programs like the Thrift Savings Plan so that they'll have a more secure financial future. And then I also have a story about the work that you've been doing on graphene. Vice President Biden learned about graphene, and so for the last 7 years, I will occasionally get a phone call from a panicked speechwriter on Air Force Two who will call me up and said, "The vice president keeps on talking about something called graphene. Is it really true that you can put like a tank on a piece of graphene?" So this is obviously a technology that is going to have a huge impact not only for the Navy but for our economy and our society. And one example of the impact that the Office of Naval Research has had is that if you look at the history of science, if you look at the history particularly of post-war science in the United States, you will see entire PhD theses that are devoted to exploring the impact of one member of the Office of Naval Research. So one example of this is Mina Reis, who is involved in creating mathematical sciences at the Office of Naval Research, and also played a critical role in the development of digital computing. And one scholar said, "Any respectable description of what Mina Reis has done, rather than an enumeration of the positions she's held, will inevitably lead like a concise history of American mathematics during the last few decades." So that's the type of impact that the Office of Naval Research has routinely had. And the work that ONR has done has had huge implications, not only for the Navy, but for our economy and our society. And on behalf of President Obama, I also wanted to thank ONR for playing a really important role in supporting a number of the President's science and technology initiatives, whether that's the Materials Genome Initiative, which is an effort to reduce the time required to discover and develop new materials, or the President's goal of creating a network of manufacturing innovation institutes, which the Navy has supported, the National Robotics Initiative, or some of the really phenomenal things that ONR has been doing in the area of advanced training technologies. And one of the reasons that this is so important is that if you look at the Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse, which is an effort to try to identify what educational interventions we have that improve student performance, what you discover is that most educational interventions either have no impact, or if they do, they have a really modest impact on student learning outcomes. And some of the things that the Navy has been investing in has the potential to, I think, really transform education and training. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about today was, in addition to the phenomenal importance of the work that ONR does, is the question of institutional innovation. So the importance of looking not only at scientific and technological innovation, but what are the policies and practices and ways of doing business and institutions that we need to support that innovation. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of some of the types of ways of fostering innovation that I think are really interesting and important. One is the identification of grand challenges. So in the same way that President Kennedy said, let's put a man on the moon, and we decided to not only sequence the human genome, but to drive down the cost of that from $100 million to $1,000, which is opening up the door to precision and personalized medicine. What are the similarly ambitious goals that we should be setting in the 21st century? And a good grand challenge is something that is ambitious but achievable. So if I said that I wanted immortality and the end of scarcity, that would certainly be ambitious, but it wouldn't rank very highly in the achievable category. There needs to be a Goldilocks level of specificity. So again, if I say, I want to improve the human condition, that really doesn't tell me where to get started. And ideally, it should be something that can really capture the public's imagination in the same way that previous grand challenges have done. And I think if this is done well, these can create positive self-fulfilling prophecies. So some examples of grand challenges that this administration is pursuing. One is the BRAIN initiative, which the president announced in April 2013, which is aimed at dramatically increasing our understanding of how the interaction of 80 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses combine to create learning, memory, perception, action, consciousness, and all the other amazing things that the brain can do. And the Department of Energy has several. One is called Sunshot, where the goal is to make solar as cheap as coal by the end of the decade, or EV Everywhere, which is aimed at making an electric vehicle as convenient and affordable to own as a gas-powered vehicle. But we're also seeing companies and universities get involved in this as well. So IBM has been driving advances in artificial intelligence by beating Garry Kasparov at chess and Ken Jennings at Jeopardy. And Elon Musk of SpaceX has said, I want to die on Mars, but not on impact. So his modest goal is making humanity a multiplanetary species. UCLA has decided to organize their current capital campaign around LA 2050, the goal of making the Los Angeles region 100% sustainable in terms of energy use, biodiversity, and water. So that's one thing that I think is something that, as you think about the next 70 years of the Office of Naval Research, whether there's some grand challenges that would be appropriate for ONR and the Navy to embrace. One that we thought about is that as you know better than I, we know a lot more about other planets than we know about our own ocean. So why is it that we still have only mapped a really, really small part of the world's oceans at high resolution? So that's the first approach that the administration has been promoting and as part of the President's innovation strategy. The second is the use of incentive prizes. So this is obviously not a substitute for grants and contracts, but a well-designed incentive prize does have a number of advantages. It allows the sponsor to pay only if someone is successful, to shine a spotlight on an important problem, to go beyond the usual suspects. So, for example, the Air Force was interested in the challenge of how do you stop an approaching vehicle at a checkpoint without blowing up the vehicle of the occupant. And the winning submission came from a retired mechanical engineer from Lima, Peru. So these open innovation approaches really allow us to expand the pool of ideas. And these incentive prizes allow us to establish a goal while not having to choose in advance which team or approach is most likely to be successful. So Charles Lindbergh did the first transatlantic flight in response to a $25,000 prize from a New York hotel owner. He had a very unconventional engine design, and so he never would have made it through peer review. So these approaches have some advantages. Another thing that the administration is encouraging is new models for empowering frontline employees. So the NSA has created something called the incubation cell, which is giving frontline employees who have some new ideas for carrying out NSA's mission the time and resources to be able to explore those. The HHS Idea Lab is giving more of their 90,000 employees who have an idea for improving the nation's health with the time and resources to explore those ideas. And here in the Navy, you have the Athena Project, which is doing the same for sailors. And I think that this is particularly powerful when you combine the flexibility of a sailor or a Marine who sees a problem and wants to do something about it with the democratization of the tools that are necessary to design and make just about anything. So, if you give sailors and Marines access to the tools of digital fabrication, which include not only 3D printing, but laser cutters and desktop computer numerically controlled machine tools, what they can do is really amazing. So I think a goal of the Navy and the Defense Department more broadly should be to increase the number of military MacGyvers who have the ability to not only to see a problem, but to do something about this. And we have a growing body of evidence of the huge return on investment in terms of things like repair and maintenance that the Navy can get by providing access to these tools. Another really important area for us to continue to do experimentation is in the procurement system. And as a number of the speakers have noted, there are some areas, whether it's machine learning or constellations of small satellites or robotics or UAVs or cybersecurity or cloud computing, where the commercially driven private sector is investing more in R&D. There are shorter product life cycles, and these are technologies that are very on very different cost curves. And obviously that's not going to be the case in stealth and nuclear submarines and hypersonics. But where that technology is, where the sort of center of gravity has shifted to the commercial sector, we need mechanisms that allow us to be able to tap that expertise. And so whether it's using other transactions authority or other mechanisms that allow us to do business with companies that would never do business with the government under the FAR, because they're not going to come up with a separate accounting system in order to do business with the federal government. We need to figure out how to be able to tap that capability. And I'm not just talking about buying commercial laptops. I'm talking about being able to leverage that global, rapidly changing commercial technology base to solve hard Navy and DoD problems. Another thing that we've been doing a lot is to look at the way we recruit and hire people. And so this really became an issue that was top of mind for the president after the less than successful launch of healthcare.gov. And everyone knows the story about all of the challenges that were associated with the launch. I think fewer people know what happened, which is that the White House was able to recruit some of the top talent from the technology industry who are willing to drop everything and come and fix it. And in a very short period of time, working with federal employees and contractors. And I think after this, the president, I think appropriately asked, well, why don't we wait? Why don't we have these people at the beginning waiting until there's a crisis like this? And it turned out that a lot of people who were earning a lot more, the federal government is not going to compete on the basis of salary, stock options, and espresso machines. But what a number of these people discovered is that the problems that the government works on were a lot more rewarding to them than the relative wealth of one billionaire versus another billionaire. And so they were willing to come and work for the federal government and really start working on changing the way we design and deploy citizen-facing digital services. And it's had a really dramatic impact. Not only the work that they're doing, but just bringing these new methodologies into the federal government and beginning to change the way the federal government does business. So I think this notion of, there are a lot of people who, if you went to them and said, how would you like to work for the federal government for 30 years? There are many people that would take a pass on that. But what we've discovered is if we can do a better job of identifying the hard problems that we're working on, we're able to recruit some of the top talent from the private sector in a tour of duty. Another one that I would mention is operational innovation. And this is something that the previous USAID Administrator Raj Shah thought about. So he wanted to increase the role that science, technology, innovation, and partnerships plays in the way we do global health and global development. And this is a capability that USAID had in the past. They had played a critical role in fomenting the Green Revolution, which probably saved hundreds of millions of people around the world from starving by increasing agricultural productivity, but had really allowed that capacity to atrophy. And he recognized that if he made this effort to recruit more scientists and more engineers and more entrepreneurs to USAID and did nothing to change the way that USAID did business, that all those people were going to be incredibly frustrated. So he introduced this doctrine of operational innovation to say innovation is not only the job of scientists and engineers, it is also the job of people who work on procurement, the people who work on HR, and even the lawyers. So they now have one of my favorite job titles, which is the Chief Innovation Counsel. That is a lawyer whose job is to figure out how to say yes. So this is something that I'm encouraging every department and agency to think about. We talked a lot about the idea of the offset strategy. Bill Perry, who played a very important role in the second offset, precision weapons, stealth, C4ISR, is serving as the course advisor to a Stanford course called Hacking for Defense, which I encourage all of you to Google about. So basically the course is taking the same methodology that is used for startups for doing something called the Lean Launchpad. So this requires scientists and engineers to go talk to 100 potential customers to find out whether they're working on a problem that ultimately their customers will care about, and has been applying that to defense and national security and intelligence problems. So there are now teams of Stanford, multidisciplinary teams of Stanford students that have been working directly with a DoD or IC sponsor. And their goal is to now spread this to another 50 campuses across the country. And their experience was that half of the teams now want to continue the work. So if you want to talk about a really great strategy for partnering with young minds and addressing the fact that what are the figures on the 50% of the S&T workforce is going to be eligible for retirement pretty soon. So creating a pipeline of young scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs who know about important Navy and DoD problems, I think is going to be really important. I wanted to sort of close on one thing that I'm concerned about, and would love to get your thoughts about whether this is something that I'm right to be concerned about. And it's certainly not a problem that is unique to the Department of Defense. And it was, I think, nicely summarized by Larry Summers, who I've had the opportunity to work with since the late 1980s and served in both the Clinton and Obama administrations, most recently as the head of the National Economic Council. And he was talking about the fact that there's this bridge in Cambridge that 100 years ago took 11 months to build, and that has now taken over 5 years to repair. It's a 232-foot bridge, and he noted that Julius Caesar's men built a bridge that was 6 times the size across the Rhine in 10 days. And he talked about a phenomena called American sclerosis. So he says, a gaggle of regulators and veto players, each with the power to block or delay, and each with their own parochial concerns. Every actor, the historical commission, the contractor, the environmental agency, the advocacy groups, the state transportation department, is reasonable in his or her own terms, but the final result is wildly unreasonable. So the question I have for you is, are there some things that we face when we think about not the phenomenal investments that we're making in science and technology, but all the challenges that are associated with making the government and the Defense Department and the Navy a great adopter of this technology, where everyone is acting in a reasonable way and doing his or her own job. But when we look at sort of the overall outcome, we have a lot of work to do. So I'm interested in your thoughts about whether you agree, and if you do agree, what are some concrete steps that we could take so that we can get faster results in terms of going from the phenomenal investments that the ONR has made in science, technology, and innovation to the capability for the warfighter. So again, congratulations. on a terrific set of accomplishments, and keep up the good work. Thank you very much.